I just wanted to say that I'm really impressed with how far we've come listening to this morning's presentations. I mean, even in the last year, there's been a lot more consensus building around using Psychosene as a second-tier test in newborn screening. More labs are screening, and I think more and more groups are becoming aware of the need for early referrals and rapid diagnosis for the rare but very important early infantile cases. I'm just going to ask Anna, do you have my slides? Ah, there she goes. Okay. I guess for the many of us who've been working on this for a very long time, it feels really good to have come this far. I'm going to give you a brief overview and update on the Krabbe Newborn Screening Council. Next slide. So just for a little bit of background, as you've heard, I really can't credit the New York State experience with newborn screening enough, because they provided an enormous amount of critical information to move the field forward. And Joe Orsini, who is you just heard from, is really the leader of the newborn screening lab in New York that took the risks, made the observations, and moved the field forward. As we know, the original risk assignments we all put together for screen positive babies in New York was too broad. It did not have Psychosene in the algorithm, and it identified babies who we called at risk, but who were not affected with Krabbe disease. And the initial protocols or algorithms we made for follow-up of these babies were too invasive. Testing was too frequent, and for that reason, compliance by families and treating physicians was poor. And there was very valid criticism regarding placing families who are not at risk under the stress of worrying that their baby might have Krabbe disease. Next slide, please. Oops, back one. So the recognition that Psychosene, as you've heard earlier, and you heard from Dieter, who really developed this technology for at least clinical application, could be measured on newborn blood spots, and the observation that Psychosene could differentiate the babies with the most aggressive form of early infantile Krabbe disease has transformed the algorithms for newborn screening. So early infantile Krabbe disease babies who have a positive newborn screen will have a Psychosene over 10, and they can be rapidly identified and referred with parental counseling and agreement for referral for transplant, or in the future for gene therapy. Later onset Krabbe disease babies, meaning babies with a positive screen and an intermediate Psychosene, generally defined as between 2 to 10, can be identified and followed based on risk stratification. And Rob is going to talk about this in much greater detail. Unaffected babies, those with Psychosene less than 2, will not require additional follow-up. So there's many babies in this, what used to be a gray zone of no one was sure what would happen, who now can be reassured and will not even be notified that they had a positive screen. And many newborn screening labs, as you've heard this morning, have incorporated Psychosene into their second tier or reflex testing. And based on the conversations we had earlier this morning, I cannot emphasize enough how important that is, because it does clearly differentiate the early infantile disease affected babies, and it enables rapid referral without waiting for molecular testing. And I'm not saying molecular testing shouldn't be done. I am just saying it can be pending while the baby is referred and prepared for treatment. Next slide. So you heard there are 9 states performing newborn screening for Krabbe disease, and hopefully 3 more who will join soon. If you add up all the numbers we heard this morning, roughly 6 million babies have been screened to date. And there are 3 companies developing gene therapy for Krabbe disease. one, where it will be administered after hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, and two, where it'll be administered more as a single standalone therapy. And again, the RUS application was recently submitted thanks to Anna and Joe and their team, and an incredible amount of work from a lot of people. So fingers crossed that the application is much stronger now and has addressed the concerns of the that were raised by the original committee review that Dieter went over this morning. Next slide, please. So we created the Newborn Screening Council to really formalize a process that had been going on for many, many years. And what I mean by that, and I'll just speak for myself, is that if someone reached out to me, a family, with potential where they heard that their baby or their child might have Krabbe disease, and they provided a certain amount of information in their outreach, I would then reach out to Joe and Dieter and Mike Gelb and David Wenger as my kind of core team to say, okay, let's look at this and let's decide if we think this baby has Krabbe or not, or is the baby at risk for future disease. And when I say this, I mean kids who had new mutations or something that was not part of the very classic algorithm of the 30kb deletion, homozygous deletion, which you can see in rare babies with the early infantile form. And so that process worked just informally for many years, but as more states started screening, we recognized that we needed to formalize a process that states that were screening could participate in, families could also participate in, and treating physicians who had referrals of babies or children with possible Krabbe disease could reach out to. And so we created the Newborn Screening Council, and the plan was to assess policies and recommendations and to serve as a resource for the newborn screening labs and doctors to review complex cases and determine consensus for the best path forward for these babies. And I'll just mention that these sometimes are very complicated situations. There's not a clear right answer. And so it takes putting the minds of all the experts together to reach the best decision. The goals of the Newborn Screening Council are multiple, but one is to have all newborn screening labs enable Psychosene testing with a rapid turnaround, hopefully less than 2 days. We're encouraging each state to develop a predetermined roadmap for referral of early infantile Krabbe disease patients who are identified to transplant centers for transplant or later to gene therapy programs, because if you take one message away from this whole day, it's that treatment has to be done early. Early means in the first month of life, and earlier is better in all types of approaches. And that's, of course, our goal. We also had the goal of developing guidance for identification of babies at risk for late onset Krabbe disease and risk stratification and follow-up protocols. And Rob is going to discuss those in his talk. He already published a manuscript describing this, and a manuscript describing the outcomes of 6 babies identified through newborn screening and transplanted in the last 5 years is written, but it hasn't been accepted for publication yet. But we'll present updates of that group in a few minutes. Next slide. Okay, so the purpose of the council is to continuously improve newborn screening for Krabbe disease. That includes methods for testing and follow-up algorithms, to update and improve how the results of newborn screening tests are communicated, to make changes to recommended follow-up protocols as the field evolves, to provide this forum to discuss difficult cases, to provide a platform to discuss any other issues related to screening for Krabbe disease, to provide feedback on any proposed changes to screening, and to ensure that all members are informed of the latest improvements, new treatments that are available, and to review status of gene therapy protocols so that we can help shunt patients who may be eligible to the appropriate study. Next slide. The co-leaders of the Newborn Screening Council are myself and Joe Orsini, and our administrative director is Anna Grantham, who really keeps us on our toes and on track. The members are members from newborn screening labs, transplant centers, laboratory experts on design of the diagnostic tests and newborn screening tests, clinical experts, including neurologists, geneticists, developmental pediatricians, MRI experts, et cetera. And we will add gene therapy centers as that part of the therapy evolves. We've had 9 virtual meetings to date, approximately monthly, and we've reviewed 5 unusual cases this year. We first invited industry partners to attend some of these meetings, but we found that it became a very large meeting, and it also was difficult to figure out how to present information about individual cases and maintain confidentiality and follow HIPAA with industry on the call. So we modified that a few months ago to have quarterly meetings with industry, but the monthly meetings with the other members of the council and without the industry partners. Next slide. You've heard that there are 2 manuscripts that are either came out or are being worked on this past year. And then the rest of the application went in, and we're continuing to provide ongoing consultative support for the difficult cases. Next slide. Dieter showed this, but I just wanted again to emphasize, and I hope you can, well, you can't see my pointer. If you look in the upper right, at the highest box, that's the Psychosene in kids with early infantile disease. And if you look at the green box on the bottom of that upper graph, you can see what you're comparing to in healthy babies. So there's no question that the Psychosene is able to differentiate the babies with the early infantile cases. The second box to the in the right, but to the left, which is above the green bar, is the babies with potential, or at least at risk for, later onset Krabbe disease. And again, they distinctly separate from normal kids and kids who are carriers. So this is a very important advance in technology, and we all should be using it. Next slide. So Rob will go into this, but we really are at a place where we can distinguish early infantile Krabbe disease based on a positive screen and a Psychosene over 10. We're also in a place where we can distinguish babies at risk for later onset Krabbe disease with a positive screen and a Psychosene between 2 and 10. And maybe most importantly, we can determine who is not an affected or at-risk baby and not recommend follow-up and not put families under stress when there's no need to do that. Next slide. And Rob will talk next about the newborn screening guidelines and the follow-up for babies with later onset Krabbe disease risk, and whether they're high risk or low risk, and what the pathways for follow-up should be. Next slide. So we made a lot of progress. We still have a long way to go, but things that are being researched right now include in transplant ways to enhance CNS engraftment with toxins that kill the resident microglia so that engrafting macrophages can engraft in higher amounts in the brain. We're looking at Duoc cells, which is a microglial-like cell we can give intrathecally. There's work going on with other monocytes from cord blood and cord tissue, mesenchymal stromal cells. The most exciting work is in the gene therapy arena, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow. And maybe at the end of the day, we'll end up with combination therapies that have the best outcomes. Next slide. These are the members, at least the core members of the Newborn Screening Council. There are many others who join the calls. We're continually growing, but everything I'm telling you about is really the result of the work of the entire group. So thank you very much.